Angry Moderate, June 28th, 2012. Oh, it's a difficult day for those of us who live in the middle of the political spectrum, neither on the right nor on the left, but down the middle. Oh, what days are these? Remember that from Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Oh, what days are these when shrubbers are harassed in the street? Anyway, interesting day. Interesting information in front of me with regard to the world of moderation, moderateness, moderatism. It's a new political party. Are you a Democrat or a Republican? No, I'm a moderate. No, that's an ideology, but no, I'm part of the moderate party. I think we need to have a moderate party because both of our political parties in our dual political system, this is not a multi-party democracy, it's a two-party quasi-democracy run by two monolithic groups with opposing views that continue to get more and more extreme. If this is the political spectrum and we move out from the middle, we're moving into this ground, and I'm going to tell you why, but first I'm going to drink caffeine. Fantastic. Tip Top Cafe has fantastic coffee and great chocolate chip cookies. I'm having a chocolate chip cookie for lunch and coffee for lunch. And for those of you who think that that's unhealthy, you are wrong. There's nothing wrong with a little chocolate and caffeine for lunch. So remember that. Anyway, here we go. There's so much to talk about. I don't know where to begin. Anyway, first piece of news. Congress may cut food aid. This is in the Valley News. Right? The Valley News. Congress may cut food aid. From Washington. Newsline by Lisa Mascaro. With 1 in 7 Americans now receiving food stamps, Republicans in Congress are leading efforts to cut back the social safety net program that has swelled to one of the largest in the federal government, and they're getting some support from Democrats. That was cookie drool. Ugh. So let me get this straight. There are more hungry people in the country, and lawmakers want to cut back on aid for the hungry people. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? I mean, well, yeah, but there are more hungry people, so let's not feed them. Because perhaps if we don't feed the hungry people, they will think that life is better for them because... What? With 1 in 7 Americans now receiving food stamps, Republicans and Democrats are going to cut back on, they're going to cut spending on food stamp subsidies, SNAP subsidies, right? Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Right? Food stamps has a negative connotation, so some genius in Washington is like, oh, let's come up with a new acronym. How's about SNAP? That sounds great, doesn't it? Makes it seem less onerous. Oh, for crying out loud. So, when you have a huge body of people who cannot afford to pay for food, and as we inflate the money supply, which we are doing as a way to try and offset our economic contraction, our contractionary environment, as we inflate the money supply through the auspices of the Federal Reserve in concert with the Treasury Department, as the Treasury Department offers bonds on the bond market at auction, and everybody else says, no, I'm not buying those bonds, and the Federal Reserve says, sure, we'll do it. As the money supply is inflated, the cost of goods naturally goes up because A, there's more money out there, so there's more money competing for a certain amount of goods, and so the amount of money it costs for those goods tends to go up. Also, the people who get a hold of the money that the Federal Reserve, this is all review. Have you watched my show before? This is review. The people who get a hold of all of those monies that are created by the Federal Reserve are the wealthy people who take that money and invest it in commodities and invest it in equities and ramp up the price of those commodities. So if you ramp up the price of rice, if you ramp up, you go to the co-op now, a bag of wild rice is $9. $9 for a bag of rice. $9 for a bag of rice. Are you kidding me? So people can't afford to buy that rice, so they have to go on food stamp subsidies. They have to get subsidies from the government to afford. No! Oh, no, no, we don't want them to have those. We want to cut back on food stamp subsidies so that they can't afford the rice. Well, what? See, what you're doing out there, you Republican people, and some of you Democrat people who have decided to side with these Republican people, what you're doing is you are creating not only suffering. I mean, let's face it, in austerity, when austerity is created, suffering is created. They go hand in hand. Austerity, a cut in spending, leads to human suffering. I know that for a lot of you out there, that's not an issue, right? There are people out there, particularly on the political right, but all over the political spectrum, for whom this is not an issue. That if there are government cuts to certain subsidies, you don't feel the impact. There are a lot of people in the Upper Valley who do feel the impact. And there are an extraordinary amount of people around the country who do feel the impact of these kinds of spending cuts. And so here we sit in this fascinating situation in which more and more people are unable to afford the basic goods that they need and services that they need to get by. And what is our Congress doing? Our Congress is saying, well, let's see. We need to balance the budget. No, we don't. We need to balance the budget, and we need to stop deficit spending. No, we don't. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut services and cut social services and cut spending for the poorest people, for the people who need it most. Well, there's 315 million people in the country. I mean, we can't serve everybody. Really, who we're going to serve are the people who pay for the elections. And we're going to serve those people who come to Washington and lobby and say, hey, governor, senator, representative, if you would like a house in the Hamptons, we would be happy to put in a nice marble floor for you, wink, wink, nod, nod. And we'll do that if you vote for a certain thing that benefits us, and we don't care who it injures. It's in our self-interest. Unbelievable. Congress may cut food aid. More and more people are on food subsidies because they can't afford food. And Congress, instead of understanding that we have no limits to the amount of money we can create, it's just we have a broken monetary system. And that monetary system is broken because the money that's created doesn't go to the people who need it. It goes to the people who don't need it. And it goes to the corporations who don't need it. And they use that money to buy the political system. We are becoming an anti-democratic system bought and sold by people and corporations who are becoming multi-billionaires. Look, look. I got my little list of things to talk about, right? A billionaire bought a Hawaiian island. Coffee. A billionaire bought an island. Now, you might be saying to yourself, oh, so what? So, he was bored. He took his multi-billion dollars and bought an island. No big deal. Well, certain things about it strike me as being somewhat of a big deal. First of all, there's a perversion in the way we view money and the way money is created and who gets a hold of that money. It is extraordinary to me that we have multi-billionaires and people who are approaching trillionaires. We have people who are probably worth between $50 and $100 billion right now. People whose net worth far exceeds the gross domestic product of most of the nations of the world. We have mass starvation and suffering throughout the world. And these people who are bored because they have all this money, what am I going to do with my money? I've built so many houses already. What am I going to do? I think I'll buy an island. Oh, which one? No. Remember Lex Luthor from Superman? What was the name of the actor? He was also in the Poseidon Adventure. Gene Hackman. When he goes, what do you want? When the Zod, General Zod says, what would you like? And Lex Luthor says, Australia, right? He wants to become the king of Australia. Understand that we are at this point now where billionaires are bored and they're spending their billions of dollars buying islands. How long is it going to be before somebody buys New Jersey? Now, granted, buying New Jersey would not be such a bad thing. Maybe we could buy New Jersey and have it secede from the Union, right? New Jersey, right? What exit? I don't know. But seriously, kind of. Here you've got all of these folks who are becoming so extraordinarily wealthy that they are buying, not only are they buying islands, they're buying, so this island becomes his little fiefdom, right? If it's his island, can he govern that island the way he'd like to? Even though technically I would imagine it's supposed to fall under the laws of the United States. But if he owns the island, it's private property, right? Wouldn't the Supreme Court, which I'm going to get to, wouldn't the Supreme Court rule that he can do anything on that island he'd like to do? Right? This kind of reminds me of the movie with Woody Allen, Bananas. Right? Remember the movie Bananas? Have you seen it? Yeah. Look, for those of you who don't go to see or don't rent Woody Allen movies, like, what are you doing? I realize that this is the Upper Valley. It's not New York City. But you gotta, he's a genius filmmaker. Anyway, in the movie Bananas, it's all about what happens in a banana republic and dictators taking over. But it's, it's a farce. It's funny. But there's an unfunny side to all of this. And the unfunny side to all of this is that our democratic institutions are being eroded, and extremism is increasing, and it's becoming harder and harder for people who are on the fringes to make ends meet, and those fringes are becoming bigger. And people, 1 in 7 Americans, do you know how many people that is? 1 in 7 Americans? It's 40 million, 45 million Americans who need food subsidies, and yet you have billionaires buying islands. Billionaires who are going to create laws that completely supersede the laws of the United States and of the Constitution on those islands. And seriously, how long is it going to be before municipalities are being purchased by the super wealthy? Why not? Didn't some actress, I can't remember who it is, didn't she buy a town in Alabama? And it was a failed venture, but why wouldn't at some point Bill Gates, instead of living in Washington, why not just buy a couple of towns there? Gatesville, right? Potterville. This is a troubling, troubling time. It's a troubling time. And a lot of the reason that it's troubling, for me, as someone who looks into the future, is that human beings, by our very nature, have a difficult time planning ahead. We have a difficult time looking down the road and saying, okay, 20, 30, 50 years, what's going to be the impact of our actions, right? So let's take the environment, for example. We have a very difficult time looking down the road and saying, okay, well, 50 years from now, what's the impact? What's going to be the impact of the pollutants that we put into the environment? Or what's going to be the impact of climate change created by the release of certain kinds of chemicals into the air? We don't look down the road. We kind of think in the short term in terms of what are our needs right now. We have a difficult time looking decades into the future as to what is going to be the outcome of our actions. So let's take today's Supreme Court ruling on the health care issue as a perfect example of how the United States, human beings in general, but I live in the United States, that's what I'm focused upon, how our narrow-mindedness with regard to looking down into the future, 5, 10, 20 years, would undoubtedly have a profound impact upon our lives, and particularly upon, I'm almost 50 years old, but upon my children's lives. So, today, as you know, well, today it's June 28th, but you're seeing this show in July. But today, June 28th, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4, essentially. There are a lot of nuances, but essentially the Supreme Court ruled that the majority of the tenets of the health care bill that was passed by the House and the Senate and that was promoted by the Obama administration was in fact constitutional, based upon the idea that you could create a mandate for payment in that it was constitutional vis-a-vis taxation and the government's ability to tax. And here's what I'm thinking. I'm not looking at the short term in terms of what does that mean with regard to affordability of health care. I'm not looking at that sort of short term, near term, 1, 2, maybe 3-year issue. I'm looking at it in terms of 5, 10, 20 years, and not in terms of health care, but in terms of the tenor of the debate and what's happening in our country with regard to this extremification. There's no word, right? Oh, yes. That'd be a great word at a spelling bee. Extremification. Can I get a definition, Stan? Well, yes, the process of becoming more extreme. Oh, yes, extremification. E-X-T-R, anyway. Extreme, this idea of things becoming more extreme, of the moderate center becoming a more extinct, more moving toward extinction, and then they're becoming a really, really vociferous and possibly violent left wing and a vociferous and violent right wing as part of the political debate. And here's my argument. If you've been listening to the radio or watching the news today with regard to the Supreme Court decision, you have heard a lot of vitriol and a lot of really emotional testimony, a lot of emotional statements, a lot of emotional speeches on both sides, the left and the right. The left saying, it's a great vindication for not only the president, but also for the rights of poor people to be able to get health care, etc. And on the right, you hear a lot of, the government is forcing us into things that are against our will. 5 people on the Supreme Court have made a decision that totally goes against the will of the people. You get the picture. And so what you hear is a rising tone, a rising anxiety level, more and more tension, more and more anger on both sides. The anger on the right is a response to the celebratoriness, the celebratory feelings of the left. And as the left celebrates more, the right becomes more angry. And as people on the right, it could be the other way around, by the way. This is not, just so happens that in this case, it's the left that's saying, yay, and the right that's saying, blah. But it could be the other way around. But as the right becomes more angry at what they perceive to be an injustice perpetrated upon them by a left-wing, quasi-socialist administration, there is more of a chance for there to be a violent response to these kinds of actions. Not on the part of the mainstream of people on the political right, but on the part of fringe elements who are completely irrational. Because what happens during these times of heightened emotional response to political issues is that oftentimes our reactive brain, that primitive brain, takes over, and our ability to reason goes by the wayside. During the period of time in the early 20th century, early mid-20th century, 1940s, when India was striving for independence, to become independent from England, to become its own home rule, an independent country, there was a great deal of consternation in the late 40s and then into the period of independence, but really in the late 40s as India was moving toward trying to decide whether it was going to be India or whether it was going to be a country split into two, right? India and Pakistan, a Hindu majority and a Muslim majority. There was an extraordinary amount of fear that existed on the part of many Hindu Indians and Muslim Indians. And those fears were capitalized upon and exacerbated by the rhetoric that was going on in political circles. And people who were in political leadership on both sides, the radical Hindu side and the radical Muslim side, played upon those fears so that what you ended up having was riots. Massive, enormous, terrible riots in major cities all across India. Thousands of people were killed because this fear that people felt was tapped into by exploitative leaders and by people trying to capitalize upon this period of weakness in the country. Now, jump to 2012, June 28th, here in the United States. And we are at a period of weakness, right? There are a lot of questions as to our future. There are questions about how can we feed everybody? There are questions about how can we make sure everybody has access to health care? There are questions about how can I make enough money to make ends meet? And as those fears rise, all of a sudden you have this Supreme Court decision that ignites this furor around those issues. It's not directly about those issues, but it ignites a furor. So then you start listening to people like Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and all of these dudes on the radio and on TV who use these kinds of issues as a way to benefit themselves. They use these issues as a way to aggrandize themselves so that they can gain more attention and power and money. So you listen to these guys, Dennis Miller, he's not, and people on the left too. And the way they twist not just the information, but the way they use propaganda, they use rhetoric, they use language to get people even more situated in that rear brain, that reactive brain, that angry mind, where irrationality becomes the norm. Where all of a sudden the dialogue is no longer a rational, reasonable, fact-based, data-based, rigorous, scholarship-based dialogue, but it becomes just a vitriolic, anger-based, irrational dialogue. And then, of course, it's not a dialogue at all, is it? And what you're going to see over the next several months leading up to the election you're going to see protests that break out that are actually going to be not something that the United States is used to in the last 50 years, right? Go back to the 1960s, 1950s, particularly the 60s, and we look at the civil rights movement, we look at the anti-Vietnam War era, and we see a lot of social upheaval. We see protests, remember Chicago, 1968, we see a lot of that. We are moving in that direction again. We're moving in the direction of a more extreme society because A, there's a lot of economic uncertainty, B, people in power are using that economic and social, physical uncertainty to build and aggrandize themselves, to make themselves wealthier and more powerful, and exploiting other people along the way. There are also new media, ways to exploit and use the media to exacerbate those tensions. Now, this is a short-term thing. I mean, I'm talking about now the next, leading up to the election. But looking out into the future, 10, 20, 30 years, where are we headed? The foundation, the basic fundamental foundation of this entire discussion is based upon money, monetary policy, money. We live in a country that has a fiat, an irredeemable currency. We can print as much money as we see fit. It's not tied to gold. It's not tied to any commodity. There are no operational limits to the amount of money that can be created. The only issue that faces us is, how is that money regulated? Who gets that money? As that's the foundation. That's the fundamental basis of everything that we're looking at right now. Could the Federal Reserve monetize $1 trillion in U.S. debt as a way to fund health care for everyone? Oh, of course they could. I mean, there are no limits, no operational limits to doing that. Would there be ramifications for those monetary policies? Of course. It's inflationary by definition. Those monetary policies are inflationary by definition. The issue facing us, and the issue facing us down the road 10, 20, 30 years, is are we going to reform our monetary system, or are we not? Are we going to have a monetary system in which people can become trillionaires, or are we not? Or are we going to place limits on the amount of wealth that people can accumulate? It's the bottom line. It's really the only issue. Everything else stems from that. Everything else is ancillary. Everything else is tangential to that issue. Because if we continue to move in a direction in which monetary policy benefits the top 5%, we will eventually live in a society in which all democratic institutions have eroded and in which poverty is so rampant that you will have a nation that doesn't even reasonably, in any remote way, look like it does today, where you have such extraordinary poverty and so many, over 100 million, 130 million people in very difficult economic situations, and you may very well have a government that does not take care of them. A government that cuts back on subsidies for those people. If, on the other hand, we move in the direction of ending our current structure with regard to money and monetary policy, you are going to have a backlash on the part of those people who benefit from the current system, and you are going to have increasing extremism. If we have a monetary system in which only the wealthy and only the top 5% benefit, and you have more and more poverty, you are going to have a backlash on the part of those people who find themselves unable to feed their families and put a roof over their head. Do you get the point? The point is that what we have done is we've set up a situation in which down the road, whether it be this decade or the next or further down the road, unless we totally revolutionize how we view money, we are going to have an extreme political and social upheaval. We have to. There doesn't seem to be, to me, a way out of that dead end. You have, on the one hand, a monetary policy and a monetary system right now that benefits one class of people, and that class of people is essentially subverting democratic institutions as a way to create more power for themselves. And as the have-not group grows and grows and grows, there is a more vociferous and eventually, and this could be a left-wing ideologically, Marxist ideologically response. Look, why do you think there was a Marxist revolution in Guatemala? Why was there a Marxist revolution in Nicaragua? Why was there a Marxist revolution in El Salvador? Was it because these folks were like, oh yeah, Karl Marx, good guy, yeah. Was it because people in Central America had an affinity for German philosophers? No. It was because people in Central America identified with the ideological construct that their poverty was created because someone else was amassing extraordinary wealth and they were suffering, and Marx, through his writings, articulated that. Ho Chi Minh, Marxist, Vietnam. Were the Vietnamese particularly enamored of Germanic culture? No. But Marx said something that spoke to people in that situation. Now, you're sitting out there and saying to yourself, oh, Dan, you're a Marxist. No, I'm in the middle of the road. Right down the middle. Maybe a teeny bit on the liberal side. Down the middle of the road. Because here's the deal. Were the Marxist revolutionaries, once they took power, a righteous group? For the most part, no. They tended to become totalitarian dictatorships who purged the other side. Extremism is extremism, left or right. Right? Marxist and left-wing or fascist, right-wing, extremism is extremism. How do you, as a society, alleviate the possibility of there being an extreme political and social response? Well, I don't know if you can over the course of, generations. I don't know if you can. I mean, it may very well be that because of the fact that we are, at our very basis, basically, a species that is guided by self-interest, and because the accumulation of wealth is the absolute, like the pinnacle expression of that self-interest, maybe every society eventually implodes upon itself because greed and because that almost Pavlovian response to money and to access to wealth, maybe that rules the day regardless of rationality, and eventually you end up having a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots, revolt. I mean, maybe that's how it always goes. Maybe that's just how it works. But how has the United States, you look at a lot of countries around the world over the last 100 years, and there have been, extraordinarily extreme responses, political responses, social responses to suffering, to war, etc. The United States has been, for the most part, even though we've had our moments, a fairly moderate nation. The political discourse, even though during the 1960s it moved out toward the fringes, it came back. And the political discourse in the 1980s was more centrist. More, not totally, but more centrist. But I look at the situation now and I say, my gosh, let's just look at the Republican Party. Let's look at coffee first. Oh, that's good. Good coffee. Let's say the Republicans now, that the Health Care Reform Act, has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Let's say that the Republicans are able to use that as a rallying cry to win the day in November of 2012. So let's say Mitt Romney becomes President of the United States in 2012, and let's say that there is a congressional mandate for Republicans in 2012. And so you have a Congress that is Republican and a Republican president. So the Republicans are now in power. It's January of 2013. Mitt Romney has done his his acceptance speech there. What's that called when when you become the president, right? There's a word for it again. And he says, okay, now we're going to cut spending. And all of these, Tea Party, right-wing Tea Party Republicans who ran on the platform of balancing the budget, no more deficit spending, less government, smaller government, they all say, okay, now we're going to cut spending, right? So what are they going to cut spending on? Well, they're not going to cut spending on the military because they're, for the most of them are fairly hawkish on the military side, and they don't want to cut spending on the military. So they're going to cut spending on social programs, right? Food stamps, right? Cut spending on food stamps. And they're going to cut spending on unemployment insurance, and they're going to cut spending on all of these social safety nets that the 100 million Americans who find themselves in financial extremis rely upon in order to get by. Are they going to do that? Are they going to do that? I don't think so. I think that cutting that kind of spending would be political suicide, wouldn't it? Because all the people who voted for them, the top 5% wouldn't care because they've got their house in the Hamptons. What do they care? But all those people who have been duped on the right, all of those working class people who have been duped on the right into thinking that somehow the Republican agenda is in their favor, all of a sudden would find all of their access to health care cut off, all of their access to food stamp subsidies cut off, and they would be like, oh, wow, that was a big mistake, wasn't it? And so the left wing, the Democrats, would say, oh, great, right? Thank you very much, Republicans, for doing that, for cutting all that spending, for moving us into a period of austerity. And now everybody's suffering even more than they were under us. Everybody's suffering even more. It's an easy election for the Democrats, right? Democrats come back in 2016, easily win the day because the Republicans have followed through on their promise and cut spending, and more people have suffered. So the Republicans come to power, but they have to find a way not to follow through on their promises and not get caught in the lie by the American people. But the American people catch them in the lie, and they get voted out of office anyway. So, number one, if we have a Republican sweep in November, it's going to be a 4-year deal. It'll be a 4-year deal. And if the Republicans really do follow through with their program of austerity, they will create more extremism because more people will be hungry, because more people will be unemployed, because more people will not have unemployment insurance. Do you see? And you end up, again, moving away from the center, moving away from the center. The center is created by a meeting of needs. Political and social moderateness is created when people have food, when people have a job, when people have a home, when people are settled and feel secure in the basic necessities. Remember Maslow, the pyramid? Maslow, pyramid. The pyramid of human needs. Abraham Maslow, philosopher, Brandeis University. And he talked about this pyramid of human needs, and the only way you can get to the top of the pyramid, self-actualization, is if the foundation of the pyramid has, food, shelter. You got to have the food and the shelter in order to be able to do everything else. So moderateness, a country in which people are politically and socially down the middle, is created and nurtured by security, food security, housing security, job security, all of those things. Well, we have created a monetary system in which that becomes impossible. Don't you see? The monetary system is rigged to benefit a couple of people. Okay, a couple of hundred people. Okay. A few million people. Look, let's talk about this $8 billion that Goldman Sachs, no, not Goldman Sachs, I'm not a big fan of them, Morgan Stanley, sorry Goldman's, shouldn't have jumped on you, right? Morgan Stanley, right? Wasn't it Morgan Stanley, this $8 billion losses? And What do they... Do you know what short selling is? Do you? Right? Ooh, there's a fly. Short selling is when you essentially bet against the market. Essentially. It's when you basically say, look, I think this stock is going to go down, and so what I'll do is I'll take a bunch of shares, lend me 1 million shares of this stock, and then you bet again that it's going to go down, you give the 1 million shares back, and you pocket the difference. Look, these folks who are multi, these corporations that are, have assets in the hundreds of billions of dollars and nominal assets in the tens of trillions of dollars based upon credit default swaps and other exotic derivatives and investment, these synthetic devices and mortgage-backed securities and la. These people who are the market makers, who create the markets, look, they can create lies as a way to drive the market in different directions and create wealth for themselves, whether or not the market goes up or down. Look, there's a company that has created a technology that supposedly scrubs coal so that that coal can burn more cleanly. Whatever. Do I know if the technology works? I don't know. But a guy wanted to make a lot of money on this company. But he didn't know anything about the company, but he had a lot of money. He was a multimillionaire, and he wanted to make a lot of money. So what he did was, he went on to a bunch of chat rooms in a bunch of very high-end financial blogs and websites and created lies about the company as a way to get people to take their money out of the company. Well, he was shorting the company. Meanwhile, right, he had borrowed essentially 1 million shares of the company at like $10 a share. He had to return the 1 million shares, but when he created these lies about this company, the stocks went right down the tubes. So he takes the 1 million shares at $10 a share, the stock goes down to $5 a share, he buys them back at $5 a share, gives the $1 million, the million shares back, and pockets the $5 million difference. That's how our system works. If you're part of the inside, if you're part of the wealthy elite, you are always insider trading. You always have access to information that the rest of us have no access to. If you're out there and you're like me and you're part of the working class and you're investing in the stock market, like, what are you doing? It's like purely hopeful. Has very little, if nothing, to do with the profitability of a company, whether it's a good company, whether it's a well-run company. You're just hoping that some guy like this guy who lied about this, this clean coal technologies company, lies in a way that benefits you. You're just kind of sitting there with your fingers crossed. You're playing the lottery. You're rolling the dice. It has nothing to do with anything other than luck. And the insiders are totally manipulating the markets. Look, there are these things, as you know, called credit default swaps. And credit default swaps are, in essence, insurance policies that were created as a way to hedge against losses, particularly in the equities markets. So you could essentially say, I think that, or the bond markets, I think that Spain is going to go down the tubes, and I am going to buy a bunch of their bonds at 7% interest. But if they do go down the tubes, I lose my investment. So I'm going to hedge against that by buying insurance from companies like AIG, who had no money and no intention to pay off their bets, right? No intention to pay off of their insurance policies, their swap policies. And so you end up with a situation in which people are purposefully trying, through lying and insider deals, to make the market go down. Look, Morgan Stanley doesn't care that they lost $8 billion. Those $8 billion that they lost, we know what we're going to find out. We're going to find out that there was a bunch of insider trading and a bunch of naked short selling on those very things, those very portfolios that went down the tubes. And somebody became a multi-billionaire on those very short sales. This is a broken monetary system. The angry moderate is feeling rather agitated. Have some coffee. Always brings me back to a good place. It's a broken system. We have a broken monetary system. We have a monetary system that's completely out of control. It's not because money can be printed at will. That's not the reason. It's because we have no regulation. It's not because we live in a nation in which we employ a fiat currency. Don't listen to Ron Paul. He's an idiot. It's not because you want to go back onto a gold standard. Don't listen to the gold standard people. They're idiots. Under a gold standard, you have limits to the amount of money that can be used for the social programs that are needed. In a fiat currency system, in an irredeemable currency system, in which as much money as needed can be created by a central bank, the issue that creates the situation in which we find ourselves now with an economy that is in a lot of trouble is a lack of regulation. The problem is that everybody is guided by self-interest. And so that those one or two honest regulators are trumped by the regulators who get bought off. Look, our politicians in Washington, many of them may have gone to Washington with noble aspirations, but even noble aspirations are guided by self-interest. Even people who see themselves as selfless are guided by self-interest because they see being selfless as a wonderful thing. It makes them feel good. That's self-interest. The feeling good is self-interest. So, as a species guided by self-interest, how do you create a monetary system in which there is actual, real, verifiable, legitimate regulation that looks out for 310 million people? How do you do that? I don't know how you do that. But I do know this, that without changes to our monetary system, we are going to see an increasing gap between rich and poor. And when rich come to power, essentially when you have a political agenda, which you eventually have to have, a political agenda that is fearful of debt and that is fearful of government spending, and cuts back on government spending, you have too much suffering, and you end up with that straw that breaks the metaphorical camel's back, and you have conflagration. Right? You have social upheaval. On the other side, if you end up in a situation in which you try to reform the monetary system and take away that ability of those people who are super wealthy to become even more super wealthy, you have conflagration. You have extremism. Both paths lead to an extreme position. I think that the solution lies in two places. I think the solution lies in small communities. You know, we do that in our communities here in Vermont. We do CSAs, we do barter, we do listservs, we do trading, we try to take care of each other to a certain extent. I think that that's where one of the solutions lies. I think the other solution lies in having the courage to have a long-term view of what money is and what wealth is, and over the course of time, tweaking money as a way to rein in super wealth, while at the same time not reining in, to a great extent, the standard of living of people. People are absolutely terrified about the idea that their standard of living will be impacted by a more socialist, for lack of a better word, I'm just going to use the word socialist, monetary system. That there would be a terrible hit upon their standard of living. And then the people who exploit that fear and create an irrational dialogue, not based upon data or fact, but based upon fear and reaction, are the Rush Limbaughs of the world. And listen, I dare you, over the next couple of months, if you have the stomach for it, to listen to these guys. Beck, Limbaugh, Hannity, Savage, Dennis Miller. You listen to these dudes on the radio. Listen to the way they exploit people's fears and get people to a point where they are ready to rage. And when people are ready to rage, the people who are on the fringes become violent. I don't like John McCain. I think John McCain is a jackass. But I will say this. I remember during the debates leading up to the 2008 election, there was a woman who came up on the stage, and John McCain was, you know, going off on how the socialist agenda and the redistribution of wealth, and Barack Obama's a terrible socialist and all this stuff. And a woman got up on stage and she said she was fearful and that he is a terrorist and an Islamic terrorist. And McCain said, no, lady, that's just not right. He's not. He's a Christian, whatever. I mean, he's, you know, blah, blah, blah. Not that Not that I am in any way implying that there's any difference between the two religious groups. It's all the same as far as I'm concerned. But the point that McCain was making, and what he did, was he diffused the situation. In that moment, I had some respect for him. Because even though I do think that he's a bit of an idiot when it comes to his use of rhetoric, in that moment, he diffused a situation that he could have capitalized on and ramped up even further to both aggrandize himself and to create even more of a tense situation. I mean, do you think that these folks who are on the radio would have any resistance or that they would not at some point, if it meant to benefit themselves, if they thought it was the right thing to do for themselves and if they thought it was the right thing to do for the country, that they would start pounding their fists and demanding everybody hit the streets in protest? Do you think that they would not do that? Of course they would. Do you think that the men in India in the 1940s who thought that this situation that was happening in India as it was moving toward independence was going to subvert Muslims and was going to put Hindus on top of Muslims, both politically and socially, do you think they had any compunction against essentially asking Muslims to rise in revolt? No. And they marched right into that situation. And literally thousands of people died. So, I'm going to have some cookie. And some coffee. So, we really sit at a very scary place. And when I say that taking a long-term view. I don't know much about the health care bill. I got to be honest with you. I know that I have to buy my own insurance because my job doesn't provide, I don't have a job that has an insurance component. I know that cost is prohibitive. I know that, for me, my deductible is like $14,000, right? It's one of those deductibles where it's like, I have the insurance, in case something really bad happens. But everything, if I have a little pain here, it's like, ooh, his shoulder's a little sore. Maybe I should go to the doctor. I can't afford that. But I don't know much about the health care bill. I mean, I have some ideas. I mean, I've read, some secondary sources about it. I haven't read the bill itself. I haven't read the law itself. But I've read, opinions on it on both sides. I've tried to glean from both sides some of the, criticisms, blah, blah, blah. So in the short term, I'm not as concerned about what is going to happen in this finite little period of time between now and 2012. But the election, or after the election. That doesn't concern me as much, because I do see us still not way out on the fringes in terms of ideology. I see us moving in that direction. What concerns me is how issues like healthcare, how issues like, not so much these days our foreign policy, but how domestic issues, how jobs issues, how unemployment issues, how food stamps, how these issues over the course of the next decade are going to, we're not going to see a lot of improvement in the situation for the majority of Americans. And it concerns me that the dialogue and the rhetoric surrounding these issues becomes more and more irrational. And it concerns me that because we have a monetary system that is really, really profoundly broken, and broken in favor of a very few, that concerns me a great deal. Because until we reform the monetary system, all of these other ancillary issues are difficult to fix. We always have coffee, and that's a good thing. We always have chocolate, and that's a good thing. But the Angry Moderate is actually kind of a little concerned about, again, you would think that because I tend to lean a little bit to the left on certain issues, I tend to see 315 million people and want those 315 million people to be able to eat and have houses, etc., that I'm a little less on the right, a little more on the left. You would think that I would be celebrating the upholding by the Supreme Court of the Obama health care plan, whatever you want to call it, but I'm not. And it's not that I'm not, it's not that I'm like, dour about it because, the government is creating more taxation. That's not it at all. The thing that concerns me is that the ramping up of the extreme dialogue in this country and the inability of the majority of people to use their ability to reason, the inability and the choice on the majority of Americans to simply listen to people with whom they identify ideologically and buy what they're saying without any kind of discerning thinking. Look, the rise of extremism is the most dangerous thing to our nation right now. The rise of extremism, based upon whether it be a move toward austerity or whether it be based upon a move away from, the rise of extremism is the most dangerous force facing us in the next 10, 20, 30 years. You look at Europe right now. I shake in my boots when I think about the direction that Europe could head if it doesn't have the wisdom to realize that the European Central Bank could fix, at least in the near term, this terrible suffering that is going to be visited upon the fringe nations of the European Union vis-a-vis all of the moves toward austerity. Austerity and lack of spending and lack of resource allocation is the thing that leads to extreme political and social responses. That's the thing that keeps me up at night, except for when I have Indian food and then lie down too quickly and I'm like, burp, oh, and that keeps me up at night. You know, I get the old, acid reflux going. Anyway, I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover. Oh, I did want to say this thing about Eric Holder and him being held in contempt by Congress. I think this is hilarious. I got to say, like, congressmen and congresswomen are on the top of the list of people who have no, like, their lying is like they are professional liars. Because you've got these people who are standing up there and saying, oh, Eric Holder, he's withholding all of this information. We need to hold him in contempt. Why didn't we hold Hank Paulson in contempt when he lied about the Troubled Asset Relief Program? Why didn't we hold Neil Kashkari, his, right-hand guy, in contempt of Congress when he lied to Congress? Why don't we hold all of these other people who come in front of Congress and lie about all of the stuff that's happened in the economy over the last 4 years? You know why we don't? Because we know that if they told the truth, the economy would tank. So the Congress says to themselves, oh, yeah, well, they were lying too, but we're not going to hold them in contempt. We're going to hold this other guy in contempt because it's political, it's a circus. It's circus Washington style. It has nothing to do with anything other than these guys in Washington trying to make themselves more powerful based upon blah, 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 blah. It's extraordinary. So anyway, that was a briefie about the Eric Holder and contempt of Congress thing, which is quite a sham. So we covered Eric Holder, we covered food stamps, we covered short selling and naked short selling, we covered the billionaire buying the island, we covered the healthcare situation, and most importantly, I think that I, as much as I possibly could, stressed this idea that we are moving into a period of extremism that really scares me. And it wouldn't have mattered which way the healthcare situation went in terms of this recent vote. The healthcare bill and the vote by the Supreme Court, the ruling by the Supreme Court, the healthcare situation is just one more piece in the puzzle of why we are a society that is broken. And the health, whatever direction it went, whether the ruling had been in favor of sort of the direction it went with the liberals and the left being happy and the right being sad, or whether it had gone the other direction, the dialogue is becoming more extreme. The interaction between both sides is becoming more extreme, and it's all based upon the fact that Maslow's pyramid of self-actualization is falling down. Food and shelter and job security and all those things that 300 plus million people need to have in order to be able to live a comfortable and secure life is going away. And the reason it's going away is because we have a broken monetary system. And until we fix that monetary system, until we figure out a way to fix that monetary system, we are going to find ourselves in this crisis. This crisis is ongoing. This crisis is going to go on for decades. And this crisis is not going to end well until we fix the monetary system. And I don't know how to do it, but Tune in next week because I'll figure it out by then. This is The Angry Moderate. Good night.